Today's topic, and through the next week if you want to come back to the repeat sessions on Thursday and next Tuesday, is quality by design space for pharmaceuticals and beyond, which is just another way to say quality by design. It's not just for pharmaceuticals. Now, all of the examples today will be regarding pharmaceuticals, but as with any kind of design experiment example, substitute in your names for your factors and your names for your responses, and it's still the same basic type of experiment. If you're new to design of experiments, there's all kinds of free resources available to you. You have all of our website to look at, not the least of which is the previous webinars, as well as various LinkedIn groups, the ASQ Statistics Division, and the Studies Professional Networks, which is the friend and clients of Studies. Many places out there where you can get help for doing designed experiments. So for those of you who might not be in pharma, what the heck is this quality by design stuff? QbD for short. Well, what QbD is a scientific, risk-based, holistic, proactive approach to product development. The point is you need to be able to prove you understand how your product attributes and process relate to product performance. If you have good first principles knowledge of that, a designed experiment might not be necessary. But a design experiment gives you that data-driven proof that may be required to make your point. So the QbD has these key elements to it. You want to be able to hit the target product profile, show that you can, figure out what the critical quality attributes are, and be able to show that you have control of them, and be able to link those raw material attributes, formulation, and process parameters to all of those critical quality attributes and give yourself some risk assessment. Things are going to vary is kind of the whole point of this. You need to demonstrate that you understand how that variance happens and affects your process. The design space for the FDA type submissions is where you say, this is where I know my process, I know it's in control, I know that I make good product here, and the FDA in turn will approve that design space as an operation range for your product. So long as your inputs stay in that operational range, you're making good product that doesn't need to be resubmitted. After this, of course, you have to be able to show that you can actually meet that design space requirements, which is that control strategy idea, and then deal with changes that happen throughout the life cycle of the product you're making. Put those fires out that occur during production. Staying in that whole design space is the key to solving all of these types of problems. Now, first principles approach, you have your experimental data and mechanistic knowledge to model and predict performance, demonstrating you understand your process and can control it. In the absence of mechanistic knowledge, sometimes statistically designed experiments can be a very good substitute for that. It gives you those models that you can use as prediction systems to give you an idea how your process changes. And then, of course, the scale-up correlations work. Semi-empirical, use that engineering knowledge to figure out what happens when you go from lab to bench, or go bench to lab to process, and work your system through that way. And of course, all of these combinations. There's no reason to limit yourself to just a designed experiment, although that's pretty much going to be the topic of today's talk. So the idea behind all of this is you got your design space. The design space is that yellow oval there, arrived at through experimentation, a bunch of competing quadratic models, lets you know that your system will work to your satisfaction in that area. And then it's up to you to define your control space within that design space for setting up your process. So the guidance, and note that the word guidance and guidelines appears a lot. These aren't set in stone rules. It's still a growing thing. And we're making suggestions about what we can do to meet these requirements, these guidelines. So take everything as what I say is not coming from the FDA or other regulatory body. Take it as someone who understands what we think they want, and this is a way to show them that. So long and short, you put all of your process knowledge together and demonstrate that you can have an assurance of quality. The DOE provides that data, provides that model that will do just exactly that. So long as things stay inside the design space, not necessarily the control space. The control space can be moved so long as it stays within that design space. It's not considered a new change or new product. If you leave the design space, then you have to have that new product and new regulatory approval in the pharmaceutical world, or you need to go to your customer and make sure that what you're doing now is acceptable in the industrial world. Clear enough? So, quality by design through designed experiments. We're mostly in the idea that we're going to be confirming that the systems work the way we think they should, learning where they do and or don't, and confirming those results to understand that we're doing what we need to do, or maybe learn that we weren't as stable as we thought. It's all part and parcel of how this system works. The tool that we use and recommend is the tolerance interval. Tolerance interval is defined by being confident that you're estimating the population parameters, the mean and standard deviation, and then expanding that interval to include 99 or more or less. It's up to you, your particular process, of the population of all future outcomes will meet certain specifications. The use of DOE to get that model and link the response as a function of the process factors, the inputs to your process, is the way we are choosing to do that. The tolerance interval gives us the ability to back off from the edge of defining our design space. It gives us that ability to deal with variation. To do that, though, we need to make sure we have a designed experiment that is robust enough to keep the tolerance interval within reasonable limits. So finding the design space with DOE. The tolerance interval, as I mentioned before, is used to set that operating window and show that you can consistently meet the specifications. Optimal design is a good tool for this, but we're not limited to optimal designs. Any useful designed experiment that can reliably model the true response surface is quite sufficient. For this example, there's 3 responses for making this tablet that are important: the dissolution, the friability, and the hardness, which all have predefined spec limits. So in this case, we're basically learning how to make this particular tablet. It may have never been made before, or we're now just trying to qualify the process. We have a pretty good idea where it will work reasonably well, but now we need to get the data and prove it to fit that design space. So what will happen is we're going to go through the analysis, and we're going to find places where all of these goals can be achieved simultaneously. So where does the dissolution exist above 75%? Where is the friability less than 0.5? Where is the hardness greater than 10? All of these things simultaneously solved for. Now, one of the issues with modeling with statistics and DOEs is the prediction you get is the predicted mean average outcome at certain settings of your process factors. If you operate on the edge, that literally means half of your outcomes will be in spec and half will be out. I don't know of anybody who can operate that way successfully. But if you apply the tolerance interval, then we're going to back off from that average prediction, still being confident, 95% confident that we've estimated the correct mean and standard deviation, but we're also now going to be trying to include that 99% of the population. That's our standard defaults that we work with in Design Expert, but feel free to change those to match whatever your process requires. So confidence interval pads your design space to give you process mean within boundaries. Tolerance interval gives us that confidence that a stated proportion of the population is within specifications. The tolerance interval is wider than the confidence interval because it has more uncertainty to deal with. There are some standard tolerance interval tables. In this case, it's called the K2 critical value. It's taken from a table that's available on the NIST Sematech website. And it's used similar to the way that a T interval is used for the confidence interval. The tolerance interval is equal to the prediction plus or minus the critical value times the estimated standard deviation. No surprises there. And as I've said, the tolerance interval is generally quite a bit wider. Now, if you look at those two formulas, you'll notice that sample size is part of the confidence interval. Eventually, when you have an infinite sample size, S over infinite is 0. Sample size not here in the tolerance interval. So it's going to hit a fixed value of the standard normal for whatever your confidence level is times the standard deviation. That will include the 99% of your population. Or in this case, it's 95. If you want to calculate it for a designed experiment, we have several things that are inputs to it. First, and not least important, is the standard deviation. You get that after you fit a model. The standard deviation, the leftover unexplained variation in your system, that estimate is used for the interval. We also need the design matrix. It's actually the model matrix. So whatever model you fit, there will be one column in this matrix for each term in the model you fit. There will be one row in this matrix for each run you've done and included in the analysis. It gives us the sample size. We also have different precision, a different width of the tolerance interval depending on where we are and what predictions we're making. So this point vector has one element in it for each term in the model, and the position will be in the coded values ranging from -1 to 1. That gives us a positional tolerance interval. The P is the proportion of the population that we're interested in. And it's really a changing function to change that proportion into a normal score, which gets multiplied by a chi-square distribution to get a handle on the estimate of the standard deviation, the variance of the variance, if you will. What this results in is D, the half-width margin of error, if this is a confidence interval, is that standard deviation times some t times some ti multiplier. Oh, and don't forget the confidence. So the comparisons. If you're working with a single sample, the tolerance interval is narrower than if you're working with multivariate space. That whole sample size thing and corrections that get applied to account for all of the possible variations of the variations. As a result, we usually like to look at it as being, for a given designed experiment, it's going to be a roughly 1.2, 20% larger than the corresponding single sample adjustment for the critical value for the interval. That's just how it happens. That helps us decide whether or not we can even meet with any design a certain tolerance requirement. If your tolerance requirement goes too short, it is not possible to solve a tolerance interval that will include 99% of the population. It's one of the rules of statistics. So basically what you get is that critical value multiplier, T, is very low. The larger your sample size, the closer to zero it's going to get. That extra D, that margin of error. For confidence intervals, they're very much larger. That's what you have to do to include the uncertainty of predicting population outcomes. Quite often, the tolerance interval makes more sense done as one-tailed. You have a limit of you don't want to go above, you don't want to go below. So the one-tailed interval will exist as your predicted outcome at a certain location plus or minus that requirement for you that you would set. So that 20% rule is how we use to calculate. You can use that K2 or the K1 table in this case for a one-tailed interval and multiply the resulting confidence interval by 1.2, or excuse me, tolerance interval for a single sample by 1.2 to get what your tolerance interval for a designed experiment would be. You kind of sort of need to guess at how big your sample size would be before you build your experiment. So for setting a design space, the goal for the design space is to define an operating window given your process factor space where we have 95% confidence that 99% of the population meets or exceeds specifications. To do this, we need to define how wide, how uncertain we can tolerate our tolerance interval to be. This takes a little bit of work to figure out. There's no real smooth guideline for doing it, but I can tell you can't go too small because if you do, there's no design that can meet your requirements. So our D's, those half-widths of the tolerance interval requirements for the dissolution is 9. And you can think of that as if we are predicting an optimal condition plus or minus how much will be an acceptable outcome for our process. So if you're predicting 100, is plus or minus 100 good enough for D? Or would you rather have plus or minus, in this case, 9? For friability, plus or minus 0.3, and for hardness, plus or minus 0.7. You also need to get some estimate of what the standard deviation estimate is going to be, some guess to it. Usually you can get that from historical data. Sometimes you have to get it from a pilot study, and sometimes you just have to guess. If you're a subject matter expert, your guess is as good as anyone's. And then we're going to use something called fraction of design space to quantify the precision. A little more on that later. You always need to take into account your input factors. Number one, because you're qualifying a process, you want to make sure that you're in a reasonable operation system. Sometimes this involves adding constraints to your process, places where you know it won't work. Sometimes you just need to limit your ultimate ranges of the factor settings. It also requires that you have a reasonable, good estimate of what model should fit the true response surface. Again, this is determined through subject matter knowledge more so than anything else. Previous experiments on the subject are a good source for how to determine what the true model is. Quadratic with a standard default design and design expert is pretty safe. It gives you a chance to get a lack of fit test just in case it turns out that you really needed a cubic model. It also has the ability to project back to lower order models if you find out it was just a linear setup. So you want to select a design that can estimate the quadratic model and meets these limits, which can be done with an optimal response surface design. And then we're going to take some time to size the design for the precision needed. And once you get to that final design that it gets built, take the time to go through each and every run. That's one of the main benefits of a design experiment, is there's a plan laid out right in front of you. Take some time, look at each and every run, make sure that you'll get meaningful information. And remember, poor outcomes is still a meaningful information, because then the model will tell you, don't do that. So that specification, that plus or minus half width, delta or D that we refer to. If the Y bar hat is that predicted model, the black line running at about a 30-degree angle upwards there, around that prediction is a confidence band. That would be the dotted curves that are on this graph. That tolerance band is including a certain amount of what's going on. How wide can it be is the question you need to ask. And that's where you specify that plus or minus delta or D that I've been referring to. The red lines are your precision requirement. And you'll see some of the predictions are well within your prediction requirement, but the ones on the extreme edge are outside your precision requirement. Which brings up the point that, of course, the actual precision, that X naught that goes into that formula I alluded to earlier, tells you what the precision is going to be. It's a function of where you are in addition to the model. So the way fraction of design space gets used is we have to provide a D and an S estimate going into this, which is on the evaluation graphs output. And if we supply the D and the S, we will get a fraction of design space plot where we draw the blue line based upon your D and S inputs, and then where it crosses the fraction of design space curve will tell you how much, in terms of a proportion, of your design meets your precision requirement. So this 53% of the design space corresponds to that 53% of the tolerance band being within your requirements. If you find yourself wanting the details, please take a look at one of our earlier presentations on how to size mixture designs. It actually works for all response surface designs that you can get to by following this link. Just go to our webinars page. It's one of the earlier ones done in 07. Okay, back to our work at hand. The desired D, or the precision estimate, is plus or minus 9. Given that we have a estimated guessed standard deviation of 2, if we plug that into our 1.2 times K1, which was about 3.3 on that earlier page, times 2, that's about 7.9. If our desired D is greater than our lower bound on D, then we can build a design that can meet those requirements. The closer the two are, the larger the design will need to be. If you go through, you can calculate all of the D divided by S ratios, and the smallest one will always be the most difficult one to achieve, and you should size your design based upon that smallest one. So a starting design, minimum default design, for that quadratic model has 6 model points in it to estimate the 6 coefficients in a 2-factor model. And we always add 5 lack of fit and 5 replicates to give us some robustness and additional precision. However, when we size the design for a tolerance interval, that 4.5 ratio, 9 divided by 2, leaves us with a design that has no capability to meet this precision. The things you can do to fix that are manage your expectations and go with a bigger D. If this is our budget, we can't get this kind of tolerance, maybe we should go to 11 or 12. Is there some way to reduce the standard deviation? A better measurement system, better control of the noise sources. You can also look at your alpha risk. If you are able to change your alpha risk, now's the time to do it. That's managing your expectations, though, because you're going to be trading your alpha risk for your beta risk in this case. The alpha risk is the probability of finding models that aren't true, the acceptable probability of finding models that simply aren't true. You have to be careful messing with the alpha. And last but not least, you can go with a smaller proportion of the population. Now you have to speak to your customers whether or not it's still acceptable for their purposes. And remember, customers can be coworkers that are just downline in the manufacturing process. So what can we do if we don't want to change any of those things? The only thing left is increasing the sample size. If we add 7 runs, 13 model, 5 lack of fit, and 5 replicates, the fraction of design space now becomes much better. It's nearly twice as many runs, but now we get that much more precision out of expanding our design. We're still only estimating 6 coefficients, though. That's the point to keep in mind. So we build this design and run it and do the analysis, and our outputs would look something like these graphs. And it certainly looks like, based upon the contour plots that I'm looking at, we have available solution space. There's places where everything crosses over. The tool and design expert that we use for this is the graphical optimization. It lets us find the sweet spots. And one of the things we've added in version 8, and we're going to continue on for version 9, is the ability to add intervals to the graphical optimization. This has been our biggest feature for supporting quality by design. You set your goals for each factor, of course, and then add the interval estimates to it. And of course, when you're doing fractional design space, we recommend the tolerance interval. What that will give you is a graph that shows, on average, where you can meet the specifications. And then by adding that tolerance interval, it gives us some uncertainty room. Back away from those edges so that at least 99% of the population will meet specifications as supplied. The next step, after confirming your results, is to define your control space. The control space being that green rectangle. It doesn't have to be a rectangle. It can be any shape you want it to be. Submitting that to your customers or regulatory agency lets them know that so long as that control space stays somewhere in the design space, you're still making the same product that you submitted to them. You have data to back yourself up, and it gives you some further work that you may want to do to confirm that everything really is working inside that area. The next step after that is, of course, prove that you can actually manufacture inside that control space. Can you control your inputs to that precision? Well, so far so good. So far we've talked about what QbD is, and we've talked about finding the design space with the DOE. And in that previous example, we had this undefined, not well-known process. We're now going to be moving into a situation where we have a fairly well-known process. And we're going to be proving that the control space we're working with really is the control space. So a new process, you use that response surface designs, RSM methods, to simultaneously model the influencing factors and focus on where to operate, and then use tolerance intervals to define the design space. We're kind of making two achievements with one design. It's a case where you don't really know where the optimum of the process is. You're not even sure you can make the right product. With an existing process, you're going to be trying to requalify it. And the design space is assumed to be known. You've got existing production data. You've been working with this for a long time. Now we're trying to confirm that we have a good operating space. In this case, we can back off and do factorial DOE with tolerance intervals limits to verify the design space and demonstrate that there's no large effects. Even if there are some effects related to the input factors over the range tested, they should be small enough that they don't violate that tolerance interval limits on the specifications. So this example, it's extrusion-spheronization. Essentially, you mix the powder and put it in the plastic mass, extrudate it. You have that wet sphere that gets coated and dried, and you end up with, hopefully, uniform spheres of the size you want. Previous work indicates that there's 4 main drivers, and it's believed that the ranges for these input factors define a effective control space. Remember, the control space is a subset of the design space. So to confirm this control space and submit it for the QbD design space as a substitute, we can build a design to fit that factorial model rather than a response surface design. The difference being a factorial model, in this case, we're expecting no model. We believe it to be stable. So we build a design and gather data that can estimate much more than a mean model. And that gives us proof that we'll be able to fit a model. Now, in Design Expert, as you build factorial designs, we automatically bring up this, do you want to check your power screen? It is not necessary because instead of sizing to meet the ability to detect an effect, which we hope isn't there, we're going to be sizing a design for a tolerance interval around a mean model. It's a different way of getting to the same thing, a design large enough to prove our point. Now in Design Expert, the way you check a factorial design like this is you go into the evaluation node, and under the model, change the order to mean. That means we are not expecting any model. There will be no effects, is what our expectation is. It's a different way of thinking about designed experiments. Moving on to the graphs, entering reasonable estimates for that D and S along with your alpha risk and proportion of the population. In this case, the D is 50 plus or minus 50. We're expecting 750 as our outcome. 700 to 800 is an acceptable outcome. That's where the 50 comes from. 800 minus 750, 700 minus 750 gives us ranges of 50. So the initial design, built without any replicates, does not meet the tolerance requirements. Does anyone see a running theme here? Instead of doing an unreplicated design, it's going to be necessary and generally expected that if you're working with a tolerance interval, you will need to at least, please note the word at least, double a standard design. The 2 replicates, and then the 2 blocks protects us in case we do a before and after, or run 2 pilot lines, or something that's not a factor in the experiment is changing. With this doubled up design, the fraction of design space goes above our line, which means the entire set of predictions will be within our tolerance interval, provided we fit a mean model. So you always evaluate your predictions versus those specifications. Is the tolerance interval within specification? So the first response that I'm going to show you is going to show what happens if we were right. It is just a mean model. There is no effects. There are no effects. And then the second one will show you what happens when there are small effects in your system. So for a mean model, the prediction is roughly 750 as we expected. Good engineers and chemists will be able to do that reliably. And the tolerance interval is very close to that 700 to 800 range. Close enough, I think we could submit it. We know that the system works through the range tested in a consistent manner. It still varies, but even expanding for a tolerance interval based upon a small sample, most of our outcomes are going to be well within specification. However, what happens when there's small linear effects? The average, the center points haven't moved. It's still roughly about 750 here. But there's some small linear effects. Looks like they're about plus or minus 10, maybe not even quite that much. How is that going to affect the tolerance interval? Well, as you can see, some of the tolerance intervals venture outside the specifications. On the left-hand side, the upper right and lower left, and on the right-hand side, the upper left and lower right. When we plot that on the graphical optimization screen by setting our spec limits and adding the intervals, we get a picture that looks like this. Instead of the entire what we thought was a good control space, those small effects end up pushing the tolerance intervals outside of bounds on these two extreme corners. That means we'll need to redefine our control space to be somewhere in this internal bright yellow area. So this gets to the point where I start to wrap things up. I haven't seen any questions come through, so either I'm doing a good job or you have no questions. So summarizing, you want to start with a designed experiment that can meet and estimate a tolerance interval capable of proving your point. So the functional design, you want to size your confidence intervals. That's when you're trying to optimize the process, find the trends in your system. But when you're looking to verify specifications, then you really need to be sizing for tolerance intervals. So the TI multipliers are always going to be much bigger than the CI multipliers. CIs will shrink towards 0 as the sample size increases, but the TIs will not. It will shrink towards the normal score times standard deviation. This means to get tolerance intervals within reasonable limits, you will require a large design. And there's only so small tolerance intervals can get. So be warned, if you try to make your process behave better than it actually can, the design will tell you there's no solution. So the design space determination, that's what quality by design is all about. The goal of it being carry forward knowledge about what your process can actually do with some data to prove it to carry out to your customers and or regulatory agencies. It's multidimensional. That's where the DOE comes in and helps you out. The multidimensional parallel testing of multiple inputs is what will drive and let you focus in on what the quality by design space is. That DOE is only one tool you can use to do that. It can help you scope out initial formulation or process design, characterize how your factors work together interacting, and using response surface designs to get that numerical optimization output, and determine the design space with our graphical optimization tools. The verification step, what we talked about just now, is verifying that the confidence interval works the way it's supposed to. With a new process, the goal will be to get things done simultaneously. You're learning how to optimize your process, and you want to be able to prove that it's stable wherever you decide to operate. Find the design space. The existing process, you have more knowledge than that. You know how to optimize it. You know how to make it work. Now you're trying to prove that it does. Please note the word prove in my statements. If you have any questions, specifically, one that was just asked was how to get at intervals. Look at point number 3. If you can find that reference. And that'll show you about how to calculate many of the intervals. Now, a question was asked, can you throw more light on TIs and CIs? Well, TI is a tolerance interval, CI is the confidence interval. A TI is a proportion of the population, and a CI is the average outcome. Intervals, those intervals relating to confidence, means that if I did an infinite number of experiments with the same style and structure, if I'm 95% confident, then 95% of the intervals from that infinite number of experiments would actually contain the true intervals, the true mean and standard deviations. And yes, these slides will of course be made available. They actually should be up there now, but it may take a little while for the internet to update everybody. So you'll be able to download these slides and presentation from our website on the webinars link. Now, if we were unable to answer any of your questions or you think of them later, please do send them to the webinar@staties.com and we will answer them as soon as we can. Regarding case studies, we're in that NDA protected case study kinds of things. So we're getting a few things that were published publicly that we can present as solutions to this. But as far as case studies for how quality by design is used, those won't be presented until their patents are up. Well, that concludes the webinar. Thank you all for coming and paying attention. Had almost 100% audience viewing. That's fantastic. If you have any questions, please send them to the email. I'll be closing this down in about 5 minutes if I don't get a rash of questions. Thank you. Mm-hmm. It is not necessary to enter the signal and noise ratio every time, but that gives you no tools to manage your expectations. So if you want to get those tolerance interval estimates for the fraction of design space and or power estimates if you're doing factorial designs, then you do need to enter your signal and noise ratio. There has been debate about the tolerance interval. Is it absolutely necessary to spec for individuals versus speccing for the trend? And our position on it is, as customers who routinely take these medications and use the products that are sent out to us, the individual specifications probably is the better way to go. It gives you that added extra safety. And the cost of doing an experiment is much lower than dealing with a recall of a process that doesn't end up working because it was spec'd wrong. If you're just optimizing a process, then as I mentioned, the confidence interval, the averages approach, is quite sufficient. You're trying to model the trend and then work where your trend shows the system is best. If you want to prove that it meets certain specifications, then yeah, I do think it does need to be done on the tolerance interval side of things. Tolerance interval gives you the variances that lets you account for the uncertainty in estimating individuals, whereas the confidence interval gives you the ability to estimate, it limits itself to predicting the trend or the average. So the tolerance interval being much wider accounts for more uncertainty. It gives you that ability to work with individual specifications rather than a confidence interval, which limits you to working with, on average, we expect specifications. Averages usually don't impress customers. Version 9 is not released, but is available in the beta version. We've got that out to limited people at this point, but we're hoping later this year. Don't quote me on that. Tolerance interval better than confidence interval. I'm not so sure that that applies. It's more of the use the correct tool for the job at hand. And if you're specifying individual specifications, then the tolerance interval is the closest thing we have to that. If you're worried about modeling trend, then the confidence interval handles the likelihood of you've got the trend right. All right. With that, I think I will bring an end to this session. Thank you all for attending. And if you'll please send your questions to the webinar at staties.com, I'll be more than happy to answer them. So optimal temperature setting, for example, that would be probably optimization. Using the sizing for a confidence interval would be plenty. As soon as we can get it there, probably tomorrow. The webinar, the slides will all be available.